80 tons, picture that weight for a second. 80 tons of white pine logs stacked 20 feet high on a wooden sleigh, pulled by just 2 horses across a frozen lake. Ice that could crack at any moment. Water deep enough to swallow everything. Horses, logs, men, in seconds. The year was 1893, and this wasn't a disaster. This was Tuesday. Northern Michigan, winter of 1890. The logging industry faces a crisis that threatens to shut down the entire operation. Millions of board feet of white pine sit deep in forests with no way to reach the mills. Roads don't exist. The ground is either frozen solid or buried under 4 feet of snow. Wagons can't move. Railroads haven't reached the timber yet, but then someone notices something. The lakes have frozen solid, perfectly flat, obstacle-free, and suddenly, an impossible idea becomes the only solution. What if you could turn winter, the season that stopped all work, into the most productive time of year? What if you could haul loads so heavy that no summer road could support them? What if the ice held? The timber industry was about to find out. And when it worked, when those first massive loads crossed frozen lakes without breaking through, it changed everything. But the cost was extraordinary. Horses drowned by the dozens. Men died in ways that made newspapers stop reporting the details. And the ice? The ice didn't care if you understood the physics. It broke when it wanted to break. Imagine standing on the frozen surface of a northern Michigan lake in January 1890. It's 20 degrees below zero. The ice beneath your feet is 18 inches thick in some places, maybe 12 in others, possibly 6, where a spring feeds warmer water from below. You can't see the weak spots. Nobody can. You're a teamster, and your job is to drive 2 horses pulling a sleigh loaded with 40 tons of logs across 2 miles of this ice to reach the lumber camp on the far shore. If the ice holds, you get paid $3 for the day, roughly $95 in modern money. If it doesn't hold, you drown. Your horses drown. The logs are lost. And the company docks your family for the value of the team. The first attempts at winter logging transport were disasters. Timber companies tried using wagons on frozen dirt roads, but the loads were too heavy. A wagon loaded with even 10 tons would sink into snow up to its axles. The wheels couldn't turn. Teams of 4 to 6 horses would strain for hours to move 100 yards. And at the end of the day, they'd have transported maybe 1 or 2 loads. The math was brutal. A logging operation cutting 50,000 trees per winter needed to move 15 million board feet of timber. At wagon speeds, it would take 5 years to clear a single season's cut. Then someone noticed the lakes. When water freezes solid, it creates a surface smoother than any road. Friction drops to almost nothing. A horse that struggles to pull 1 ton on dirt can pull 5 tons on ice. The idea was obvious. The execution was terrifying. The first recorded ice road log transport in Michigan happened in the winter of 1883 to 1884 near Alpena. A small logging outfit decided to test whether frozen Hubbard Lake could support a loaded sleigh. They started small, a half-ton test load with 1 horse. The ice held, then 1 ton, still held, then 5 tons with a 2-horse team. Success! But when they loaded 15 tons, a commercially viable amount, and sent the team across, disaster struck. The horses made it 300 yards. Then the ice began to crack. Not a single sharp snap, but a low groaning sound like the lake was waking up. The driver heard it. He jumped off the sleigh. The horses sensed danger and tried to run, but the weight behind them was too great. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. Water surged up through the fissures. Within seconds, both horses plunged through the ice into 12 feet of water. The driver watched them thrash for maybe 30 seconds before they disappeared. The sleigh followed. 15 tons of white pine sank to the bottom of Hubbard Lake, along with 2 horses worth $200, about $6,400 today. The company couldn't afford to lose horses at that rate, but they also couldn't afford not to try again. Someone realized the problem wasn't the weight, it was the ice quality. Natural lake, ice forms unevenly. Air pockets weaken it. Snow on top insulates it and slows freezing. Currents underneath create thin spots. But what if you could control the ice? What if you could make it thicker, stronger, more uniform? The solution came from an unlikely source: water sprinklers. Starting in the 1870s, timber companies began building ice roads the same way they'd build any road, by laying down material to create a smooth, reinforced surface. Except the material was ice. And the construction happened at night when temperatures dropped below zero. Here's how it worked. Teams would clear snow off the frozen lake surface, or exposing the ice to extreme cold. This allowed the lake to freeze deeper, 18 to 24 inches instead of 12. Then they'd mark the route with stakes, creating a path across the lake. Next came the ice tankers. These were massive wooden barrels mounted on sleighs, filled with water from holes cut in the ice. A team of horses would pull the tanker along the marked route, and men would release water through valves, flooding the cleared path. At 20 below, the water froze within minutes, adding another inch or two of ice. They'd repeat this process every night for weeks. Layer after layer, each run added strength. The best ice roads had 6 to 8 inches of added ice on top of the natural lake freeze. Total thickness, 2 to 3 feet. That could support enormous loads. But building these roads was brutal work. The men who operated the water tankers worked from midnight until dawn, when temperatures were coldest. Their clothes froze solid. Their hands went numb. The horses wore spiked shoes to grip the ice, but even then, they'd slip, fall, and sometimes break legs on the frozen surface. One account from a logging camp near Traverse City in 1895 describes a water tanker operation where temperatures hit 35 below zero. The man directing the water flow made a mistake and flooded the ice too heavily in one section. When the team tried to cross the next day, the added weight created too much stress. The ice flexed, cracked, and gave way. The entire 4-horse team went through. All 4 animals drowned before anyone could cut the harnesses. The foreman's log simply recorded, "Lost team number 7, building road. $400 damage." Horses were tools. That's how the timber industry saw them. Valuable tools, certainly. A good draft horse cost $100 to $150, equivalent to $3,200 to $4,800 today. But tools nonetheless. When they died, you bought more. Records from Michigan logging operations between 1890 and 1910 show staggering losses. One company operating near Cadillac documented the deaths of 47 horses over 3 winters. Most drowned after breaking through ice. Some froze to death when drivers abandoned them after minor injuries. A few were simply worked until they collapsed. The Nestor Estate logging operation near Ewan, Michigan, documented the loss of 18 horses in the winter of 1892 to 1893 alone. 14 drowned. 3 were destroyed after breaking legs on ice roads. 1 died of exhaustion pulling a record load. But that record load, the one that killed the horse, became famous. It weighed over 100 tons, 18 feet long, 15 feet wide, 33 feet high from roadbed to the top of the stack. The sleigh carried 36,000 board feet of white pine. Just 2 horses pulled it. Not across a lake, that would have been suicide, but a quarter mile along a perfectly maintained ice road built specifically for the attempt. The load was photographed, loaded onto rail cars, and sent to Chicago for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, where it was displayed as one of the wonders of the world. How could 2 horses possibly pull 100 tons? The answer is ice. Friction on a well-maintained ice road was almost non-existent. The sleigh runners were made of smooth oak, 12 inches wide, coated in a thin layer of water that froze instantly at those temperatures, creating a near frictionless glide. Once the load was moving, momentum did most of the work. The horses just had to keep it moving. But getting it started required careful timing. Teams would be harnessed at dawn when the ice was coldest and strongest. The horses would lean into the load, straining until the sleigh broke free of static friction. Once it moved, they'd maintain a slow, steady pace, maybe 2 miles per hour. Stopping was almost as hard as starting. Drivers couldn't just pull back on the reins. On a downhill section of ice road, a loaded sleigh could gain speed and crush the horses if they tried to hold it back. Instead, teamsters would scatter hay or straw in the runner tracks to increase friction and slow the descent. This worked most of the time, and sometimes the hay froze and became slippery. When that happened, sleighs would pick up speed, the horses would panic and try to run, and crashes were inevitable. One account from 1897 describes a fully loaded sleigh, estimated at 60 tons, descending a gradual slope on a lake ice road near Houghton Lake. The driver scattered hay. The sleigh kept accelerating. He scattered more hay, still accelerating. The horses sensed the weight pushing them from behind and began to run. The driver jumped off. The horses ran for maybe 200 yards before the sleigh caught up to them, struck their back legs, and knocked them down. The entire load, horses, sleigh, logs, slid another 100 yards before hitting a pressure ridge in the ice. The impact was catastrophic. Both horses were killed. The sleigh was destroyed. Logs scattered across the ice. Kinda took a crew of 20 men 2 days to recover the timber. Nobody recovered the horses. They left them on the ice until spring, when the thaw carried the bodies to the bottom of the lake. But that wasn't the worst danger. The worst danger was the ice itself. You could build the road perfectly. You could maintain it every night. You could check thickness every morning. And the ice would still kill you, because ice doesn't behave the way solid ground does. It flexes, it moves, it cracks under stress you can't predict. When you drive a heavy load across ice, you create something called a deflection wave. The weight pushes down, flexing the ice and creating a depression. That depression sends a wave through the ice sheet, radiating outward like ripples on water. If you're moving slowly, the waves are small and harmless. If you're moving too fast, the waves amplify. They bounce off shorelines in shallow areas, reflecting back and interfering with each other. In weak spots, these interference patterns can shatter ice that seemed perfectly safe minutes earlier. Modern ice road regulations limit speeds based on load weight for exactly this reason. But in 1890, nobody understood the physics. They just knew that sometimes, for no apparent reason, the ice would break. And when it broke under an 80-ton load, people died. Calvin Clendening learned this on January 15, 1919. He was a livery stable operator from Klamath Falls, Oregon, driving a light sleigh pulled by 2 horses across Upper Klamath Lake. He just left a logging camp on the west side of the lake and was heading back to town, a route he'd taken dozens of times that winter. The ice had been solid all season, 2 feet thick in most places. He had no reason to worry. He was barely underway when the horses plunged through. One moment, they were trotting across solid ice. The next, they were thrashing in black water, screaming, trying to climb out but weighed down by harnesses and the sleigh dragging them under. Clendening jumped clear just in time. He ran back to the logging camp for help, but by the time anyone arrived, both horses were gone. The newspaper report noted that Clendening was lucky to be alive, and that there was no way to save the valuable animals. The cause? A spring feeding warmer water into the lake from below, invisible from the surface, impossible to detect, and strong enough to prevent ice from forming properly in that specific spot. Clendening had crossed the same area safely a dozen times. The 13th time, the ice gave way. That's what made ice road logging so terrifying. You could do everything right and still die. You could check ice thickness every morning, maintain the road every night, follow the exact same route you'd use successfully for weeks, and on any given trip, the ice could fail. Records from the time are incomplete, but scattered newspaper accounts and logging camp journals suggest that between 1880 and 1920, dozens, possibly hundreds, of horses drowned in ice road accidents across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine. The exact number will never be known. Most companies didn't report horse deaths unless they were financially significant. A single horse drowning wasn't newsworthy. Losing an entire team was. Human deaths were even more common than official records suggest. Teamsters who fell through the ice rarely survived. Water temperatures in January averaged 33 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. A man in those conditions had maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia set in, less if he was wearing heavy winter clothes that absorbed water and pulled him down. Most drownings happened too fast for rescue. One minute, a driver was sitting on top of a loaded sleigh. The next, he and the horses were underwater. But despite the danger, ice road logging became standard practice. Why? Because it worked. A single ice road could move more timber in one winter than 100 wagons could move all year. The economic advantage was overwhelming. Timber companies calculated that ice roads reduced transport costs by 60 to 70% compared to summer methods. For a large operation cutting 20 million board feet per year, that meant savings of $30,000 to $40,000 per season, nearly $1 million in today's money. So they built the roads, they lost the horses, they paid the human cost, and they kept going because the alternative was bankruptcy. At the peak of ice road logging in the 1890s, northern Michigan alone operated more than 200 ice roads across lakes, rivers, and swamps. Some were simple routes across small ponds. Others spanned miles of open water on Lake Michigan's frozen bays. The largest operations employed dedicated ice road crews, men whose only job all winter was to maintain the frozen highways. These men worked from December through March, or sleeping in rough camps, enduring cold that modern people can barely imagine. One account from a logging camp near Cadillac describes the work. The road crew rises at midnight. They harness teams, load the water tankers, and begin the night's work of icing the roads. They work until dawn, then sleep until noon. In the afternoon, they cut hay for the evening's maintenance, repair tankers, and prepare for the next night. They do this 6 days a week for 4 months. The pay is $2 per day plus food and shelter. $2 per day. About $64 in modern money, for work that could kill you in a dozen different ways, and men lined up for these jobs because $2 a day was better than the 75 cents they'd make on a farm. The danger was just part of the deal. The loads kept getting bigger. In 1893, the 100-ton record load stunned the industry. By 1900, loads of 80 to 90 tons were routine on well-maintained ice roads. By 1910, some operations were running multiple teams in succession, creating what amounted to convoys of massive log sleighs crossing frozen lakes in organized patterns to distribute weight and prevent ice failure. The logistics were extraordinary. A typical large-scale ice road operation worked like this. December, build and maintain ice roads. January, begin hauling once ice reaches minimum safe thickness, usually 24 inches for heavy loads. February and early March, maximum hauling season, running teams around the clock. Late March, operations wind down as temperatures rise and ice weakens. April, the thaw. Everything left on the ice is lost. During peak season, in a major logging camp might run 20 to 30 teams simultaneously. Each team made multiple trips per day. A well-organized operation could move 500,000 board feet of timber per week across the ice roads. That's enough lumber to build 50 houses, every week for 3 months. The scale was staggering, but the system had a fatal flaw. It only worked in deep winter. If January was too warm, ice didn't form thick enough. If March came early, the hauling season was cut short. And if you misjudged the thaw, you lost everything. Spring breakup was catastrophic for anyone caught unprepared. Loaded sleighs that hadn't made their final runs would simply sink when the ice gave way. Horses pastured on lake ice for convenience sometimes broke through when temperatures rose unexpectedly. Whereas one 1902 account from Wisconsin's Lake Winnebago describes a logging crew that waited too long to move equipment off the ice. On March 18th, temperatures hit 50 degrees. By evening, sections of the lake ice had rotted to 6 inches. The next morning, crews arrived to find 3 loaded sleighs had broken through overnight. Total loss: 150 tons of logs, 6 horses, and equipment worth $800. Nobody was on the sleighs when they went through, so no human lives were lost. The newspaper article treated this as good news. By 1915, ice road logging began to decline. The introduction of gasoline-powered trucks offered an alternative that worked year-round. Early logging trucks were primitive, slow, unreliable, constantly breaking down, but they didn't drown. They didn't require ice roads. They didn't depend on perfect weather conditions. And crucially, they didn't kill horses. The economics shifted. A truck cost $1,200 to $1,500, about 10 horses. But a truck could work year-round, required no feed, and didn't drown if it broke through ice. By the 1920s, most major logging operations had switched to truck transport. The ice roads persisted in remote areas where roads didn't exist. Northern Minnesota and Wisconsin still used them into the 1930s. Some operations in Maine continued ice road hauling into the 1940s. But the era was ending. The last commercial ice road log transport in Michigan happened in 1947. A small operation near Mackinaw City ran one final load across the straits, a symbolic gesture more than a practical necessity. After that, the ice roads became history. Today, you can still see remnants. Old photographs show the massive loads, the tiny horses, the men standing on stacks of logs 20 feet high. Museum collections hold the sleigh runners, the ice-cutting tools, the spiked horseshoes. But the physical traces are gone. The ice roads existed only in winter. When spring came, they melted. Nothing remains but water. What does remain is the knowledge of what was attempted. 80-ton loads on 2-foot ice. Horses pulling weights that defy belief. Men gambling their lives on physics they didn't understand. All to move timber from forest to mill in the brief window when winter made the impossible merely dangerous. If you've got family stories about logging, ice roads, or the timber industry, we'd love to hear them. These operations left few written records. The best accounts come from people whose grandparents or great-grandparents worked the ice. The horses are gone. The ice roads melt every spring and reform every winter, but nobody builds them for logging anymore. The men who drove those loads across frozen lakes are long dead. What survives is the evidence that they tried, that they succeeded, and that sometimes they drowned. The ice doesn't remember, but we should.